Hello, and a very warm welcome to People and Politics. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to my channel by clicking the subscribe button just below this video. I'm really looking forward to today's interview. It was somebody that I've known for a long time and somebody who is my constituency MP. Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, Ian Murray. Welcome to People and Politics. And Ian, thank you very much for coming on the talk. I'm so grateful for your time. It's good to see you again.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be on, and I'm going to enjoy the next half hour. And I'm really sorry that I'm in shirt and tie, and you're in your famous knitwear. I didn't get the memo.
I thought Icelandic was cool, but but you joined me. What's been an incredible week, and it started with a Range Rover in Downing Street, and out popped David Cameron. It's like, who's expecting that?
I don't think anybody was expecting it, David. I mean, I knew for some time that the Prime Minister was thinking about doing a reshuffle, and quite frankly, he was too weak to have sacked Suella Braverman the week before, and he was left with no choice. But who would have thought that he'd have brought back David Cameron? And the funny thing is, he's probably going through the three C's at the moment, Rishi Sunak. He started off his premiership offering credibility, of which has been completely shot out of the water now, given what's happened in the last year. Then he promised change, don't forget, only at his conference speech a few weeks ago. And now he's offering Cameron, which is the complete antipathy of both credibility and change. So we were all a bit shocked, but, this is the fag end of a failing government. And I think that's there now for everyone to see.
It was just astonishing. It was astonishing, like you said, a month or two ago. He stood at conference and he more or less condemned the last 30 years, 30 of which have been his party's government, and said he was the change we needed. And the first thing he done is brought back David Cameron. He couldn't make it up.
And of course, I don't know if you've seen Prime Minister's question on Wednesday, but Kevin Brennan, the Labour MP, a good friend of mine from Wales, he asked the Prime Minister if he could identify what the Prime Minister thought was the greatest success of David Cameron's foreign policy initiatives. And of course, everyone fell a bit laughing, including the government side, because he brought us Brexit. He nearly lost the UK, of course, don't forget, in 2014. And everything else he did from his Bloomberg speech onwards has just been a foreign policy disaster. So he's got no successes to his name in the foreign policy field, that's for sure.
It's just absurd that he's presided over what was probably the worst foreign policy decision of the last generation, and he's been brought in as foreign policy. Foreign secretary, and he can't even get into the spatula to defend himself because he's not a member of the House of Commons.
Yeah, that's a huge issue because our democracy works effectively when politicians of any colour can hold government to account and hold executive to account. And if you've not got the elected House holding the Foreign Secretary to account when you've got two major conflicts in the world and probably another dozen that the UK should be making sure they've got a close interest in, then it really does, you have to pose a question about why. And it also sends a message out to 350 Tory MPs that there's not one of them good enough to be Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, what does that say about the 350? He doesn't trust any of them so far to be his Foreign Secretary. It's just absurd.
It's absolutely absurd, and I think it's there for everyone to see. And of course, if you remember back as well, David Cameron was probably the first Prime Minister that brought in party before country. And we've seen from his successors, whether it be Theresa May, Johnson, Truss or Sunak that it's always party before country for them. And Cameron started all that because the EU referendum was party before country. The referendum in Scotland was party before country, and everything he did in terms of the way his government operated was always party before country. And I think we're really suffering from that now.
Yeah, definitely. He gave he gave the EU referendum to try and silence his party factions in this party, and Tory backfired him. I didn't think he didn't think for a minute he'd lose, but he didn't. Came back, and then speaking of backfiring, do you think Suella Braverman was? It's like she was desperate to get fired, and she should have been fired before she did. But that's what she wanted, and I think, and do you agree that she wanted to be fired so she could become some sort of what's the word, sort of martyr in party, but I don't see flocks of MPs running after her now.
Absolutely, but don't forget she was sacked before, and the sacking lasted 6 days. I mean, Sunak should never have reappointed her to Home Secretary in the first place. But of course, whether it's true or not, but what we now know from Suella's resignation letter is there was a deal done with Rishi Sunak, because your listeners will recall that when Rishi Sunak was favourite to take over from Liz Truss, there was a certain Boris Johnson lingering in the wings, and he said he wouldn't do it. But if he had put his name forward, he would have had the numbers. And I wonder if that deal had something to do with Suella backing Sunak so that Johnson couldn't get the numbers. Because if Johnson had gone back to the membership in a straight fight with Sunak, he'd have been Prime Minister again. And I think that just would have been the end, not just the end of the Tory party, but the end of our politics and the way that Parliament actually works. So now she's now resigned, or she's been sacked from Monday, and it's Thursday, so she's not quite at the 6 days yet. So she could still be.
Yeah, she could be back on Monday. Given a previous record. So I want to ask you about your background, because you grew up not far from where I'm sitting. I did over to come Queen was the youth up here. You and I have known each other for a while now. You've been my MP since 2010, and you grew up in Western Hills, which I think you probably agree is quite a, you might say a socially deprived. So how on earth does a boy from Western Hills end up as Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland?
Well, David, I mean, we have known each other a long time, and we don't see each other as often as I would like. And I'm still to come round to your allotment for a cup of tea, but we might leave that till at least the late spring, not early summer. But yeah, I mean, look, a lot of it's to do with luck, because, and we've talked about this before, statistically, if you were brought up in the family that I came from in Western Hills, a very, of course, loving family, of course, but deprived, and from a very deprived area, your statistical analysis of becoming an MP, let alone potentially in the cabinet, and certainly in the shadow cabinet, is the percentage is pretty small. And in fact, there was the percentage of pupils even going to university from my school was incredibly small. And that's a bit of luck, but also just a bit of family environment, really, in a lot of senses. But for your listeners who don't know Western Hills, it is a 1950s, 1960s peripheral housing estate in Edinburgh, like many peripheral council house estates were, that suffered from significant deprivation and lack of opportunity. And I think that's where my values in politics have been shaped from and where they come from. I went to Western Hills Education Centre, my local school, the very first community high school in Scotland, created by a certain Lord George Foulkes when he was education convener in Edinburgh.
Yes.
Or when he was on the City of Edinburgh Council. So this was I had a brilliant upbringing. I can't think of any memory in my childhood that was unhappy. I had a very loving family. I did lose my father when I was 9. He was only 39 to a hemorrhage, a brain hemorrhage, and that devastated the family. But apart from that sort of one bad news story, I had an incredibly happy and supportive childhood, incredibly supportive and inspirational teachers. And I think that's what it does. And the best bit of advice I ever got, which I always tell to young people, in fact, it should be a bit of advice for everyone, is never let an opportunity go by that you can grab and never let anybody tell you can't achieve something.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, and also from what you said, it sounds like teachers and teachers can have a tremendous influence on a young person, and I think I know when I was a teenager, it was my tutors had this tremendous influence on my life at that time. And I think you said that, I think you'd be the same as teachers and schools. They have a big impact on young people at that sort of age.
And of course, it affects individuals, as in our cases, in terms of the influence it's had on us. But actually, influential teachers and education is the single biggest contribution we can make to our economy.
Yeah.
And it creates the economy of the future, it creates the jobs of the future, it creates the businesses of the future, and it just creates this kind of society we want to live in. And that all stems back to education, whether it be education in the home or whether or not it be formal education in the education system. So I couldn't think, I can't thank my teachers highly enough. I still keep in touch with them, actually.
Yeah.
Some of them are constituents, some of them are still keep in touch, and it's always great to chat to them about the old times.
That's good. And was your mother a political person? Where did your interest in politics come from?
Yeah, well, I mean, not a political person as in a formal political person, but my family were all very small p political. We were brought up to in the 80s. We had to boot the television every time Thatcher came on. Our member of parliament at that time in Edinburgh Pentlands was Malcolm Rifkin, who ended up being the foreign secretary. So there was no shortage of figures around that could give you a contrast of your values and of politics. And actually, I think my mum's politics came from the fact that when they had my brother, who's 4 years older than me, and myself living in the house in Wester Hailes, and they'd gone to see Malcolm Rifkin to try and get a help to move house because the house was damp and the dampness was affecting the family's health, particularly with chest infections and things. And Malcolm, I maybe wouldn't say promised my mum a house because he wouldn't do that and he wouldn't be able to do that, but certainly gave the indication that he would do everything he possibly could to help, and did very little. Right. And that really, I always remember my mum telling me that story, that she went to someone for help, knowing that was what the person's job was, and didn't really get any. And I think that story gives you the sort of foundation, the platform, the springboard of where her politics comes from.
Yeah, like I say, it starts in families as a small p, and we're all shaped by our personal experience. Like you say, and that sort of a big impact on you. And of course, I'm a similar age to you. I remember very well Malcolm Rifkin in the 80s as MP for Pentland. So I think as foreign secretaries, and yeah, that was a long time ago. And
well, if you wind forward to that story 20 years, probably 20 years, maybe even longer, when I was campaign manager for the 2001 general election in Edinburgh Pentlands, when we retired Malcolm Rifkin for the second time when Linda Clark was re-elected, I thought that was a little bit of political revenge in terms of, what had happened in the past. And no personal aggravations against Malcolm Rifkin and others, but just a political one. And I think that was me getting my own back, if you like.
Good. Yeah.
And from a very working class background, my grandfather on my father's side died very young, so I didn't meet him. But my grandfather on my mother's side was a slaughterman at Malone's at Chester. They were all local.
Yeah, I remember the slaughterhouse at Chester. Yeah, so
my mum worked in bookmakers. She worked in bars and restaurants, So she cleaned in Woolies. Remember the Woolies at Lothian Road?
Yeah, my goodness, yeah.
So all of that shapes your upbringing, really. Which is why I'm so fat. I used to eat the pick and mix.
Yeah. Yeah. That sort of upbringing is very, very different to the sort of politicians who preside over us at the moment at Westminster. It's still very, very much, the Conservative Party, very kind of, from Eton, public school. I'm sure I read it a couple of days ago that Jeremy Hunt is something like the, fifth removed cousin from the Queen, or So we've still got this massive division of inequality in the country, and it's not like we've not known about it, because we've known about it for decades, and it never ever changes. And what do you think it would take for a shift in that?
Well, it's got to the first shift. I think has got to be a government that wants to change things. I mean, no individual government or individual party has all the answers to this. And in fact, we barely have some of the answers, if even just a tiny fraction of them. But you've at least got to have a government that wants to try. And I think we've got two governments at the moment who have been in power now for a decade and a half between them, and haven't really had a focus on inequality because their focus has been in elsewhere, and don't really understand it, because in Scotland the Scottish government's focus is on the constitution, and at Westminster the focus is on looking after the richest and hoping that trickles down, which everybody knows trickle down economics has never worked and never will work. And previous Labour governments have done everything they possibly could with inequality, and we have to try and do more. It's glacially slow, but if you think about the big changes to society and with the NHS and the education system in the 40s after post-war, the white heat of technology and new modern jobs in 64 with Wilson, and then in the way the country was transformed from 97 going into the new millennia with the previous Labour government. Inequality did narrow. Millions were lifted out of poverty, but it wasn't sustainable and it wasn't sustained. And inequality now is as wide as it's ever been, and there's going to have to be a pretty concentrated effort to narrow those gaps, because it's getting worse and the gap's getting wider.
Yeah, it's getting bigger, and in particular, child poverty in Scotland, I think it's higher than it's ever been. And when you sit there, the Scottish nationalists have been in power for well over a decade now, and child poverty just goes up and up and up, and they just don't seem to be capable of grasping.
And child poverty is actually is the end point of a whole host of public policy failures. It's housing, it's health, it's education, it's support, it's welfare, it's systems, it's opportunity, it's jobs, it's training, it's wages. The list is endless. There is no one silver bullet or one policy that resolves child poverty. It's a whole plethora and spectra of things, and actually you've got to deal with them all, because if you leave one element not dealt with, then child poverty unfortunately continues to rise.
Yeah, and it seems that the SNP government has spectacularly failed in addressing this. So Labour did well in Rutherglen, which was terrific, a few months ago. Do you think this might be the start of the resurgence of Labour in Scotland?
Oh, well, I hope so, but I also hope it's a resurgence of normal politics, if you like, in Scotland as well, because there is no doubt we've been pretty much paralysed in our political system because of the constitution for well over a decade now, probably a decade and a half. And the public are now saying it's time to move on. The priorities of the Scottish people are the same as everyone else's. It's the economy, cost of living, jobs, the NHS, the education system. The list is endless. And I think by the time you get to pretty near the bottom of that list, you end up with the constitution. So people's priorities have moved on. And I hope that even before the Rutherglen by-election, but the Rutherglen by-election being the result of actual crosses in boxes, that the Scottish public are ready to move on, ready to vote for change, which I think the next election will be a change election in terms of what people want to desire from it, and give politicians and political systems now the confidence that actually the public are now in a place where they want things to be changed, and they want things to be changed for the better. It's pretty tough out there for pretty much everyone. And it can't go on like this. You've got to give somebody a bit of hope.
Yeah. Having said that, do you think that as long as Westminster, deny the SNP the right for another referendum, we're gonna remain paralysed in this state for a long time?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that political paralysis in the Scottish context of the constitution is shifting because people's priorities have changed. It's pretty difficult to make any kind of argument for constitutional change or not when you can't heat your home or feed your children or
Yeah.
just live a normal life with a decent standard of living, which is what the overwhelming majority of people want to do. And therefore, I think the priorities of people have changed on that basis. And I don't think there's any appetite at all for anybody to be talking about that. And indeed, the outcomes of that being potentially worse than what we have at the moment, which, of course, as well is a big factor. So we're very keen, and Anas Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, has been very keen since he became leader 2 years ago to start talking about just the big issues that affect. And maybe he was ahead of his time because people have either caught up or moved on. And I just don't think there's any appetite for it at the moment. And if Scottish politics can break out of that paralysis of the constitution, Scotland will flourish because we've got some great things to do and we've got some great things to exploit. And that will be to the benefit of everyone. But we need to get away from this because there's no doubt that in the Scottish context as well as the UK context, it's party first, and we can't have that. We need the country first.
Yeah. I sincerely hope that we will escape this paralysis that's been strangling politics in Scotland for a good number of years. But I do worry and wonder whether we're always going to remain stuck because, as far as SNP, the constitution thing will not go away and they'll keep banging on about that. And my worry is that we stay paralyzed.
And that'll be up to the public, I think, David, to a greater or lesser extent, because if we had Indie Ref 2, we'd be on to Indie Ref 3. If we had Indie Ref 3, there'd be triggers for Indie Ref 4. So that paralysis will continue, and it won't go away by another referendum or not, or another yes, no result or not. It will only go away when people decide that actually constitutional politics is not in the best interest of the country, not in the best interest of the people that are in the country. And when people decide that, that's when it goes away. It won't go away by the politics of Scotland at the moment, because I think the SNP, or certainly Nicola Sturgeon before she resigned, said if we don't get into F2, we'll have 3, 4, 5 and 6, because they only have to win once.
Yeah, that's right. It'll be a referendum and keep going. So I hope it is the resurgence for Labour in Scotland. It will be good. I think Keir Starmer's been under a good pressure lately. There's a whole the councillors resigned about a week ago over his stance on ceasefire, and I think there was more. And correct me if I'm wrong, you're probably there. I think there's more resignations last night. Did I hear that Jess
Phillips are gone? Yeah. This is a difficult issue. It's a difficult issue for the Labour Party, and should be. These issues are not easy, and for a party that's a broad church, and as a Labour Party, and with the values that the Labour Party have, and the values that the people within the Labour Party has, this should be a difficult issue, because there are no easy answers to these conflicts in places like the Middle East, and it's not as if this Israel-Palestine conflict hasn't been going on now for generations. So it's not surprising that people off the left find this difficult, because it should be difficult, and it's horrific. You can't turn on the television without feeling heartbroken at what we're seeing.
Absolutely horrific.
Yeah, and yesterday, look, yeah, of course, people resigned for a whole host of reasons, whether they wanted to just conscience reasons, whether they wanted to make the point about ceasefire, their own constituencies, the destination and travel and policy, a whole host of things. The bottom line is, though, and this goes right to the heart of this, as a Labour Party, particularly a parliamentary Labour Party, we're pretty powerless sitting on that side of the chamber.
Yeah.
And if the only power that people in the public think we have is to have a defeated motion that calls for a ceasefire, then our ambition's got to be bigger than that. And what Keir is trying to do is to show that, look, we are a government in waiting. If we were sitting on the opposite sides of the benches last night, we would have to make a different decision on what we do. But what Keir's trying to say is, look, this is about the art of the possible over the perfect. And what we need to do is what's on the table. And I can understand people's thirst for a ceasefire. That's where we all want to get to. We want this to end. I don't think there's anybody in the world, apart from perhaps one or two zealots on both sides, that would suggest that we don't want this to end. And therefore, if we want it to end, what Keir is doing as the leader of the opposition, who's essentially the de facto prime minister in all of this discussion, is to put a policy and process in place to get to that endpoint that we all want to get to. And if you've got two, you could even suggest bad actors in this conflict, one that doesn't want to consider even the word ceasefire until all hostages are released as a minimum, and a terrorist organisation that don't want to release the hostages and have said from their leadership live on television they would do 7 October again and again and again until they eradicate Israel. It's very difficult to see how you get agreement for a ceasefire. Now, what I do understand is what's on the table is at least discussions about humanitarian pauses. And in my view, whilst not perfect, and certainly just be a tiny step forward, proper humanitarian pauses that allow you to resolve some of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza would be a small but important starting point to some kind of political discussion to a more permanent ceasefire. And that's where we are. Going straight to ceasefire, yes, it's the desirable outcome, but last night's vote wouldn't have changed a thing.
So I said that it's not come for ceasefire, because you said it would be defeated anyway.
Well, they were defeated. The government
was defeated, right? Yeah.
You know, if every opposition MP had voted for all the motions yesterday, it still would have been defeated by the government's massive majority. So, the argument that voting for a ceasefire last night would stop the bombings is a slight step away from the reality of an opposition motion that's defeated by government. And I fully nobody denies Labour frontbenchers resigning and voting for it, or backbenchers for that matter voting for it, and nobody has been disciplined in the past for coming out for a ceasefire. I think there was 19 frontbenchers that called for a ceasefire out with the voting process before last night. So this is difficult. I know it's difficult. We understand it's difficult. We all can't sleep at night, but we've got to try and find a mechanism and a process to get to the end point that we all agree we want to get to, and that's the end of this war.
Yeah, because I think how people feel, and I've included myself, that it feels that Israel's response is very disproportionate. I feel like they're belittling these poor people, and it doesn't feel, right. And there's, of course, it's all on what, talk about war crimes, and but as you say, everybody wants a ceasefire. Nobody wants it.
Proportionality is the key. Proportionality is the key word. Israel have a right, as we would expect as a country, to get their hostages back. They have a right, as we would expect as a country, to go after terrorists. We've done so before in this country. We've got history's littered with wars where people have tried to do the right thing and defeat fascism, for example, in the Second World War. So history's full of this, and I agree with you. Proportionality is a big word here, and that's why our motion last night said clearly that Israel has to do things differently. They have to do more to protect civilians. And we also said in our motion that the International Criminal Court should be looking at what's happening in Gaza. That is, it's not up for politicians to start talking about war crimes. It's up for the people who are responsible for war crimes and prosecuting war crimes to do it. I think that's why it's really important to say that the International Criminal Court should be looking at this and should be doing something about it. So, nobody disagrees even with anything you've said, David. It's just a case of how do you get there?
How do we get there? People have different ideas.
And do you get there by voting for an SNP motion that talks of ceasefire that's going to be defeated, or do you get there being a responsible party of government potentially in a year's time that says, let's get what's on the table, let's get it over the line, let's alleviate the suffering, let's press on proportionality and disproportionality, let's get the issues around war crimes and the accusations of them investigated, and let's get that pathway towards peace and a more permanent ceasefire, and towards that ceasefire by using the humanitarian pauses as a starting point. I don't think there's any other option, and therefore there might be an option tomorrow. It might happen on Saturday. It might happen next week. Things might change.
Yeah.
But at this moment in time, I think that's where we are. It's not where other people are, and I agree with that, and I accept that, and I understand it, and it's difficult. But of course, it's difficult. If it was easy, we wouldn't be having this war.
Yeah, sure. It's a phenomenally complicated situation, and it's going to be a very complicated solution. That's going to end the war, because I don't think Israel have an end plan at the moment, and we're a long way from that.
And I'm not sure Hamas have an end plan either.
No,
and the poor Palestinian people are caught in the middle of it all.
That's right.
And that's a real problem. And the complexity is there. I mean, this isn't, of course, just about Israel and Palestine. It's essentially about the whole of Jew world politics.
Yeah.
You could name any country in the world and there'll be some link to this conflict somewhere that needs to be resolved. So it's not easy, but things do move quickly. But the bottom line is there will have to be a political solution to this. It's not going to be resolved bombing and killing and bloodshed. It's going to be resolved by politics. So we need to get that political process started.
Well, hopefully Sunday the party will get around the table, but we're a long way from that right now, and much of that is utterly heartbreaking to watch the news. It's hard to watch the news right now. It's going to go on for a while. I've said that, So
and it's affecting everyone, because I just glance at my 3-year-old daughter and think it's incomprehensible what's going on there. Absolutely incomprehensible, and everyone has to be focused on what makes it stop, and that's the target for us all, and that's why it's upsetting us all, because the answers to those complex questions are not easy or comfortable.
Yeah, it's just it's inconceivable. You look at that image and you just cannot get your head around it happening, and I can't believe that your daughter's 3 years old already.
Well, she was 3 in August, so she's...
That's crazy to see. Like, yesterday I heard that she was born.
Yes, I know, it does seem like yesterday, although at least if it was yesterday, I'd have had a bit of sleep, but I woke her up at 4 a.m. this morning heading for the airport, so she's not very happy.
Yeah. Anyway, Ian, it's a real pleasure to talk to you, and thank you so much again for your time and doing the show, and I hope we get a cup of tea together one of these days.
Well, it's your round, so that thanks a lot. It's great to be on. Please listen to this and send it to all your friends.
Thank you. You can fire it around all your social media channel once I sent to like.
Great. Nice to see you.
Okay, thanks, Ian.
We'll catch up very soon.
Let's take care.
Thanks a lot.